I still remember the sound of her voice that night, sharp, dismissive, like I was something she'd stepped on. I'd brought a bottle of old wine, the kind my late wife loved, hoping to share a simple dinner with my son, Adrian, and his wife, Marielle. But before dessert, everything shifted. She laughed at my worn shoes, then smirked, "You should be grateful, Silas. Not everyone feeds beggars." The room froze. Adrian looked down, silent. That was the moment something broke inside me, and something else woke up. This story isn't just about revenge, it's about respect, redemption, and what happens when the quietest man in the room decides he's had enough. Before we begin, subscribe and drop your local time in the comments. Let's see who's awake for this twist tonight. When I left that night, I didn't say a word. I just whispered to myself, maybe it's time they remember whose house they're living in. Back home, I opened the drawer I hadn't touched in years, my wife's handwriting still gracing the edge of every page. The house deed. The taxes. Every official document. All of it still under my name. They thought I'd given them everything. Truth is, I only gave them the keys, not the ownership. Then I saw a letter from the bank, one I'd ignored for weeks. It mentioned a refinancing inquiry. My stomach tightened. Adrian wouldn't. He couldn't. But deep down, I knew my own son was trying to sell me out of my home. The next morning, I went to the bank, pretending I just needed to update my address. The clerk, a kind woman named Lydia, pulled up the records. Her eyes flickered for a second before she said, "Oh, Mr. Greystone, looks like your son's already handling the loan application." My breath caught. Loan. She leaned closer. He listed himself as owner, and his wife as a business partner. They're opening something called Maison Marielle Boutique. I thanked her, walked out, and sat in my car for nearly an hour. They'd risked my home. The one I built with my own hands, for her vanity. The betrayal stung deeper than anything Marielle ever said. And the worst part? They were already behind on the payments. I drove to the address listed on the permit, a fancy glass-front boutique still under construction. Inside, I saw Marielle showing off fabric samples to her friends. "Once this opens," she said, "the old man will be long gone. The bank will handle it." I froze. But then one of the construction workers recognized me. "Mr. Greystone. You designed this whole block, didn't you?" I nodded slowly, my mind racing. "Yes, I did. Every corner, every beam, every foundation on this street was once under my control." I walked away from that site feeling something I hadn't felt in years, pride. I whispered to myself, if I built this street, I can take it back. I called my old friend and attorney, Dorian Hale. When I showed him the forged documents, he didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "Silas, they've crossed a line. And you have every legal right to destroy them." That word, destroy, sat heavy on my chest. I didn't want revenge. I wanted respect. Dorian advised me to stay quiet, keep paying the taxes, and gather every bit of evidence before striking. That night, I was almost calm, until my phone buzzed. A voicemail from my grandson, Oliver. "Grandpa," he whispered, "Mom says you'll be homeless soon. Is that true?" I stared at the phone long after the message ended. No, I thought. Not me. Not in my own house. That night, I went down to my basement, the one place untouched since my wife passed. In a dusty box, I found the original architectural blueprints for the house. My signature. My work. My name printed on every line. It reminded me of who I once was, a man who created homes, not just for others, but for his family. I spent hours studying those lines, tracing each wall and hallway, until I saw something familiar, a forgotten clause I'd built into the ownership design. The deed and the structural registration were linked to my personal authorization. Without my consent, no one could legally sell or transfer the property. Marielle thought she had power, she didn't realize she was still living inside my design, bound by my law. A week later, a letter arrived, addressed to me, but sent by the bank. It was an eviction notice. Apparently, the tenants were being removed for failed payments. Tenants. I almost laughed. My son and his wife had listed me as a tenant in my own house. I could have exposed them immediately, but I didn't. I folded the letter, slipped it into my jacket, and decided to let them believe they'd won, for now. Sometimes, the best way to humble the proud is to let them climb higher on their own rope. I watched them celebrate that evening through the window, champagne glasses clinking. They had no idea what was coming. Marielle threw a dinner to celebrate the boutique opening. I showed up quietly, dressed simply. She didn't even offer me a seat. But I wasn't there for her, I was watching. Listening. Her accountant, a nervous young man named Caleb, kept glancing my way. When she went to take a phone call, Caleb approached me. "Sir," he said softly, "you should know she's using your property as collateral for another loan. If the store fails, you'll lose everything." I thanked him, calmly, as if he'd just told me the weather. Inside, though, I felt the ground shake. That was the night I realized I wasn't dealing with pride anymore, I was dealing with greed. I called Dorian again. This time, I asked him to gather every document we had, the ownership deed, the forged signatures, the tax receipts. He smiled through the phone. "Silas, are you ready to strike?" "Not yet," I said. "Not until they show the world who they really are." I started attending family events again, quiet and polite. I let Marielle humiliate me in front of others, calling me the old man who wouldn't let go. What she didn't know was that I had a small recording device in my pocket, capturing every insult, every false claim, every time she said, "He's just living off us." Evidence, collected with patience. I wasn't just waiting. I was building. 2 months later, the boutique failed, badly. Debts piled up. The loan defaulted. Marielle panicked. Adrian grew cold. They tried to sell the house, but the bank refused, the ownership didn't match. That's when Dorian stepped in, filing an official claim of property fraud. Adrian called me, his voice shaking. "Dad, did you do this?" I paused. "No, son," I said quietly. "You did." Then I hung up. That night, rain hit the windows like applause. And for the first time in years, I slept peacefully. The storm outside matched the one they were finally facing inside their collapsing world of lies. 2 weeks after I hung up on Adrian, I received a call from the bank manager, Mr. Halpern, a man I once helped buy his first home. "Mr. Greystone," he said carefully, "I thought you should know your son came here trying to transfer ownership again. He said you're no longer mentally sound." I froze. That's how far they were willing to go, to paint me as senile, unstable, unfit. I thanked him for his honesty and hung up quietly. That evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset turn the sky crimson. Marielle was inside, laughing on a video call, sipping wine like nothing could ever go wrong. I whispered to myself, "You just signed your own undoing." Because that phone call didn't break me, it freed me. The next morning, I visited my old friend, attorney Glenmore, who'd helped me draft a will years ago. When he saw me, he smiled faintly. "You finally ready to activate it?" "Not yet," I said. "But I need a copy." Quietly. He slid the sealed document across the table. Inside that will was a clause no one knew existed. If my son ever attempted to remove me from my property or declared me unfit, everything I owned would automatically transfer to my late wife's charity foundation. In other words, they'd lose everything, and the home would be protected forever. I tucked the will into my coat pocket like a silent weapon. They thought I was powerless. But sometimes, the strongest men are the ones everyone underestimates. Adrian invited me to dinner. It was the first time he'd reached out in months. Marielle smiled sweetly at the table, too sweet. The air felt staged, every word rehearsed. Halfway through the meal, Adrian cleared his throat. "Dad," he said, "we found a lovely care home for you. You'll be comfortable there. No more stress." I looked at him, my own son, and saw fear behind his calm smile. Not guilt, but desperation. I leaned forward, voice calm but sharp as glass. "Son, you're talking to the man who built this house. Every corner. Every stone. I buried your mother's laughter in these walls. You think I'll leave it to strangers?" The table went silent. Marielle's hand trembled slightly. I stood, left the meal untouched, and walked out. Dorian called me late that night. "Silas," he said, "you need to see this." He sent a file, bank transactions, secret accounts under Marielle's name. She'd been quietly funneling money from the boutique loans and family savings into her personal offshore account. And worse, Adrian's signature was on every form. My son wasn't her victim. He was her partner. They'd been using my name and property to launder debts for nearly a year. My hands shook, not from anger, but heartbreak. I whispered, "My own son sold his soul for comfort." But pain, when you've lived long enough, becomes purpose. And I now had both. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. For the next few days, I acted as though nothing had changed. I watered the garden. I greeted them kindly. I even fixed a loose hinge in the hallway. Marielle smirked every time she saw me. Adrian avoided my eyes. They thought I'd surrendered. But behind my patience, the storm was building. I handed Dorian every piece of evidence, along with the will. He asked, "When do we release it all?" "When they think they've won," I said. That night, I looked out the window, lightning flashing across the horizon. For the first time in a long time, I felt my wife's presence, calm, steady, reassuring. And I whispered, "Tomorrow begins the reckoning." I woke up before dawn that morning. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels like a held breath before a storm. I walked into the living room and placed a small flash drive on the table. Inside were weeks of recordings, Marielle's insults, Adrian's signatures, their plans whispered behind closed doors. Proof of their betrayal. When Adrian came downstairs, he barely looked at me. "Morning," he muttered. "Morning, son," I said softly. "You might want to be careful with what you say today. Some words don't disappear once spoken." He frowned but didn't ask what I meant. He would find out soon enough. The truth was about to speak louder than any of us. That evening, Marielle hosted a charity gala, all smiles, diamonds, and deceit. The event was held in my backyard. My backyard. Reporters were present. Cameras. Investors. She called herself the visionary behind the Greystone legacy. As she spoke, her words were smooth and rehearsed, until the large projector screen behind her flickered. Dorian's doing. Instead of her slides, the screen began playing a recording. Her own voice echoed through the speakers, "Once that old man's out, this house is ours for good." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Marielle froze. Adrian went pale. I stood quietly in the back, watching the same people who once laughed with her now whisper in disgust. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The next morning, Adrian showed up at my door. His eyes were red, his hands shaking. "Dad," he said, "I swear I didn't mean for it to go this far." She said it was all business. I looked at him, my son, trembling like a boy caught in his first lie. "Business?" I asked. "You called me unstable. You stole my home. You lied to my face for months." Tears ran down his cheeks. "She made me believe you'd already changed the will." I let the silence hang between us like a blade. Then I said, "No, Adrian. You made yourself believe it. Because greed needs no teacher." He broke down, kneeling at my feet. But I didn't comfort him, not yet. Forgiveness comes after truth, not before. That afternoon, I called Dorian. "It's time," I said. Within hours, he filed the fraud case, officially and publicly. The evidence package included audio recordings of Marielle's confessions, bank statements showing Adrian's forged authorizations, and legal documents linking every stolen dollar back to my property. The foundation I'd created with my wife immediately claimed ownership rights under the will. Marielle's accounts were frozen. The house was locked down by court order. By nightfall, the news headline read, "Wealthy couple exposed for defrauding retired homeowner." I watched the broadcast from my couch, sipping tea. Justice didn't roar. It whispered. And it sounded like peace. The silence in my home felt sacred again. 3 days later, Adrian came again, this time alone. He sat at the same table where we once shared laughter, now empty except for 2 cups of coffee. "She's gone," he said quietly. "She ran when the news broke." I nodded. "You'll have to face this, son. Alone." "I know." His voice cracked. "Dad, I lost everything." I looked at him, calm but heavy-hearted. "No," I said softly. "You lost what you stole. What you truly owned, you abandoned long before the money." He lowered his head, tears dripping onto his hands. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I just said, "Eat, son. You'll need your strength for rebuilding. If you still have the courage to rebuild with truth." 3 weeks after the court ruling, I received a brown envelope in the mail, no return address, only my name handwritten in blue ink. Inside was a letter, sealed with a mark I hadn't seen in years, my late wife's charity foundation emblem. The letter read, "If this finds you, Silas, it means the foundation's new director has something to show you, something about the house." Signed in neat cursive, Clara Greystone. My heart froze. Clara was my wife's sister, the one who disappeared after her husband's scandal 20 years ago. I hadn't heard from her since the funeral. And now, she was calling me to uncover something hidden inside my own house. What could possibly be left to discover? Clara arrived 2 days later. She hadn't aged much, still calm, still watchful. "I didn't come for sympathy," she said, stepping into the house. "I came because your wife left something here that was never meant to stay buried." She led me to the back of the basement, where I'd found the old blueprints weeks earlier. Behind a wooden wall panel, she found a latch. A door I never knew existed. Inside, we discovered a small locked chest, dusty, untouched for decades. Clara handed me the key. She made me promise never to open it unless this house was under threat. My hands trembled as I turned the lock. Inside were property papers, letters, and a photograph, my wife, smiling beside a young man I didn't recognize. The letter inside was dated 29 years ago, a year before Adrian was born. As I read it, my chest tightened. It was from my wife. "Silas, if you're reading this, I've failed to tell you something you deserve to know. Adrian isn't yours by blood. He's my sister's child. Clara begged me to protect him, her husband's debts would have destroyed the boy's life. I raised him as ours to save him. Please forgive me." I sat there for what felt like hours, the truth sinking like stones into my heart. Adrian, the son who betrayed me, the man I nearly destroyed, wasn't even mine. Clara wept silently beside me. "Now you know why I vanished," she said. I couldn't bear the guilt. That night, I walked to Adrian's apartment. He opened the door, eyes hollow, voice weary. "Dad, what are you doing here?" I handed him the letter. "You need to read this." He read it slowly, hands shaking, then whispered, "So I'm not even your son." No, I said gently. But you'll always be my child. He broke down, truly broke down this time. I put a hand on his shoulder. The truth doesn't erase the bond. It just asks us to rebuild it, this time, with honesty. He nodded, tears falling freely. I left him that night not as an enemy, but as a man reclaiming the last piece of his humanity. Blood didn't define us, choices did. Weeks later, I invited Clara and Adrian to the house. We sat in the living room, the same one where Marielle once mocked me. I signed a new document, right in front of them. Half the property was donated permanently to my late wife's foundation, for single mothers and children in need. The other half, I gave to Adrian, with one condition: you rebuild what greed destroyed. Not just the walls, but our name. He accepted, quietly, humbly. Clara smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. As the afternoon sun filled the room, I felt my wife's presence once more, warm, forgiving, proud. The house wasn't just mine anymore. It never was. It belonged to every heart that learned the cost of pride and the beauty of redemption. Months passed. The house was quiet again. The renovations had begun, new paint, new life, new laughter from the workers outside. One afternoon, I decided to walk to the nearby cafe. On the way back, I saw her, Marielle. She was sitting on a bench, hair tangled, clothes worn, clutching a newspaper with my name on it. When our eyes met, she froze. "You," she whispered, "you took everything." I looked at her, not with anger, but with something far heavier. "No," I said softly. "You gave everything away." She begged for money, trembling. And as strange as it felt, I reached into my pocket and gave her a folded bill. For a moment, she stared, unable to believe it. In that instant, I realized the title she once spat in my face had become my victory. The charity launched officially that week. Children filled the halls of the newly named Eleanor Greystone Home of Hope, my late wife's dream finally realized. Reporters asked about the story behind it. I simply said, it's built on the ruins of pride, held together by forgiveness. What I didn't say was that Adrian had become the director of the foundation. He worked tirelessly, humble, quiet, haunted, but healing. One evening, I caught him staring at the portrait of my wife in the hallway. He whispered, "She saved me twice, first by raising me, then by forgiving what I became." I placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "And now, you save others. That's how you pay her back." Just as peace began to settle, chaos returned. A journalist released a new exposé, claiming the house I lived in was built on forged land permits from decades ago. Suddenly, the foundation's ownership was questioned. At first, I thought it was a smear campaign. But when I saw the documents, my heart stopped. The signatures were mine. Or so they appeared. Someone had forged my name. Again. But this time, the forger wasn't Marielle. It was Adrian. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. "I did it for the foundation," he said. "They were going to delay construction for another year, I just wanted to keep it alive." His voice was desperate, trembling with regret. I stared at him, remembering all we'd been through. "You lied again," I said quietly. "But this time, not for greed, for guilt." He dropped to his knees. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't want to disappoint you again." I sighed deeply. "You already did," I said, then softened my tone. "But this time, I understand why. I didn't turn him in. I made him face the press himself." He did. Publicly confessing everything. The world saw not a criminal, but a man who'd finally learned accountability. The foundation survived the scandal because Adrian's honesty restored what his deception had endangered. People respected the courage it took to admit his mistake. Slowly, donations returned. The children stayed safe. And Adrian stayed humble, carrying his shame like armor against future mistakes. A year later, the house stood brighter than ever, repainted, renewed, and full of people again. Every corner echoed with life. During the Foundation's first anniversary event, a reporter asked me, "Mr. Greystone, how does it feel, after everything, being called a beggar, losing your son, and now regaining it all?" I smiled faintly and looked around at the crowd of children, mothers, and volunteers filling the once empty rooms. "I was never a beggar," I said. "I just forgot how rich I already was, in patience, in wisdom, in love." The house reminded me. The audience applauded. And as I walked through the hallway, I could almost hear my wife's laughter again, soft and proud. I stopped by the living room window, the same one where Marielle once humiliated me, and whispered, "In the end, she called me a beggar, but I was the only one rich enough to forgive." The rain began to fall, gentle and slow. And for the first time, I felt the house breathe again, not as stone and wood, but as a living story of grace, justice, and redemption. I don't tell this story for pity, I tell it because someone out there might understand. If you'd lived my story, what would you have done differently? Write it in the comments. It feels good to share the weight sometimes.